Okay, so it is my pleasure to introduce to you Aidan. One interesting fact about Aidan is that we did our PhDs at the same time at Imperial College, so we share that pain.
We suffer together.
Share that pain together. Aidan is going to talk about something quite interesting. It's a bit different to what we've seen before. It's more about having a look at some metrics that people may use for deep learning. May not necessarily be correct, and in the context of audio, what the implications of that are. So, without further ado,
thank you for inviting me, Michael. Yeah, so I feel a bit like an imposter because I mainly work in audio rather than and use AI as a tool, but hopefully this talk will give you a bit of an insight into some of the ways in which we use AI in spatial audio, at least, and some of the metrics that we use that aren't really ideal. To give you a background, so I work at this one. It's decided to. Oh, there we go. These are kind of the things we work in the VIABAL lab at Queen Mary. So we look at trying to understand spatial hearing mechanisms, develop tools and numerical approaches to sort of recreate or synthesize spatial audio. And then one of the main things that I work on is sort of deployment, as it were. So looking at hearing aids or cochlear implants and how we can use spatial audio in assistive hearing technologies effectively. But I would say these are like the sort of three domains. But today I'm going to talk about one particular challenge that we ran on head-related transfer functions. But before I do that, I think I should just give you a vague idea of what 3D audio is. 3D audio sounds elusive, but it's literally just the audio that we hear in daily life. So you can imagine that some sources are close to us, some are far away, some are moving, some are static, but they all come from different directions and they're all externalized. So we hear them around us and we have different scenes, right? So you can have like a natural environment, or you can have an urban environment. You can have, we're standing in a room now, so you have reverberation, or it can be free field because you're outside. And really what we want to do is try to recreate the audio that we hear in daily life synthetically so that we can listen to it on our computer. So then it begs the question of then how do we simulate this sort of audio so it sounds like realistic audio? And the obvious answer is we just put loads of speakers around the listener, right? So just like a cinema would or Adobe Atmos, put the person in the center, play sounds from where you want them to come from, and you've sort of solved the problem. As you can imagine, this setup is quite restrictive. It works in a cinema. Maybe if you're very wealthy and you have a big house, you can have this sort of setup, but it's not ideal. And in most cases, this is not something you ideally want. But it does beg the question, we only have 2 ears, so why do we need loads and loads of speakers? Surely if we have 2 sensors, we just need 2 speakers, which brings us to binaural spatialization. And do we really need this many loudspeakers? So binaural recordings basically work on the concept of we can recreate the sound you hear in daily life by just recording the sound where you want to play the sound back, right? So if we actually record the sound at the start of the ear canal and then we play it back through some headphones, you'll hear the sound exactly where it was recorded and it will sound externalized and realistic. Now, there's a lot of issues with this. These dummy heads are actually really expensive. It's like £20,000 and you can change the ears, but there's only like a set of 3. But the main issue, you can put this up and you can use a hard set and make your own, which if you're in academia, you sometimes don't have the money to buy this expensive kit. But the issue with this is it's static, right? So you can see the scene where there's sort of, let's say, a drum kit and a piano, and you want to externalize it. You can record that, but once it's recorded, that's all that you will ever have. You can't move around the scene. You can't move your head. So one thing to do is you could create loads and loads of recordings, or you could have lots of dummy heads. But is that really the best way? And is there a way in which we can create sort of an immersive environment that you can move around and you can move your head and use head tracking and things like this? Which brings us to head-related transfer functions, which is just a fancy name for your filters. Your ears are basically filters. They're spatially dependent, frequency-dependent filters. And can we basically capture that and use that with some anechoic speech to render the sound as though it's coming from a particular direction? So this is the lab that's at Imperial. And what we can do is we can play sine sweeps to go through the frequency range. We put some microphones in your ear, and then when we play the sine sweeps, we rotate you on a little table, so you're sitting down, you get rotated, and we can work out actually the transfer function from a given location to your 2 ears. So I think Imperial, it's like 860 different locations. Some data sets maybe have like 2,000 locations. It depends on the spatial resolution that you want. But effectively now we have a way of capturing the filtering effects of your pinna, your head, your torso. Okay, if you move your head, I guess your shoulders and things like this. But in general, the main thing we care about is actually the pinna, and your head can sort of be a potato and doesn't matter too much because it's further away from your ear. So we can do this, then it's easy to recreate sound. All we have to do is convolve the impulse response that we've measured for your particular ears with some anechoic speech, for example, or some music, and then it will sound like it's coming from that given direction. And we have to do that obviously for the left and right channel, your two ears. And then what Sonicon was looking at was thinking, well, everyone's ears are slightly different. So, and actually a lot of these dummy heads are slightly biased because they're obviously generated using or with certain sort of demographics in mind. So there's lots of debate about how accurate can people actually generalize to them if that sort of bias was there when they were made. How do we actually personalize then for individual ears? So this is just one example of a particular location and a transfer function. And you can see that there's difference in the notches and the peaks depending on the person's pinna or their ear. And is there a way in which we can personalize and capture individual ears, especially given the setup, which is quite expensive and costly, as we'll see. So this tries to capture everything that you just said. So you can imagine you can have a generic HRTF, which is sort of a one size fits all. So you just measure the transfer function for a dummy head, put the dummy head on the chair and rotate it, measure what the HRTF is. Or you can do individual HRTFs, but it's obviously time consuming and use specialist equipment. And then there's lots of arguments about how much do you need to personalize. And then there's also lots of issues with there's been loads of studies that rely on generic HRTFs and how actually useful, because no one discusses the limitations of this point, how valid are a lot of these studies now that we can sort of personalize. Anyway, so this leads on to some work that we did on HRTF spatial upsampling, which was trying to look at, can we take HRTFs and make it a bit more practical, where it's less time consuming at least? And one possible way is to do HRTF upsampling. So you effectively measure a few locations and then you try and upsample for the whole sphere over time. And the way that we first tried to tackle the problem was thinking about images. So you can imagine that you have an original image that's low resolution and you try and do super resolution. So the images here, one has been upscaled by 4 times, and this is the original. And you can see that some of the details might be wrong, but it does quite a good job. And we thought maybe we could steal some of this literature and this research for HRTFs. The issue with it is you can imagine that HRTF data is not uniformly spaced. So when we measure a HRTF, we always take more measurements around the horizontal plane, because that's where people mostly hear sound from. You don't really care too much about above someone's head because, okay, planes maybe or birds, but you're not really normally hearing stuff above you. And we can't really localize well, again, above you or behind you. So it does mean that unlike pixels, which work really well with convolutional neural networks because you have some uniformly spaced data, this is not the case in HRTFs. It obviously occupies an extra dimension because you've got these impulse responses distributed around a sphere. So it's 3D rather than 2D. And the amount of HRTF data we have is really limited. So Imperial had the largest HRTF data set that's publicly available. And at the time of this work, it probably had like 200 participants. Now it probably has like 350, but it's not massive. It's not like images where you have millions. Right? So this work was trying to solve a couple of things, which is one possible solution to this extra dimension or space is maybe we can augment the data in such a way that we get a 2D image. Yes. Yeah.
So I was quite interested in the source changing directions.
Yes.
So when the source is moving, do you simulate that in that setup, or is that?
So what you would do is you basically convolve your source with different impulse responses and you interpolate between them. So you use a weighted sum, basically.
But when you collect data in this way, are you assuming that this is not taking into account the movement of the source?
So this is more to do with capture rather than the rendering. So if you capture the HRTF, you know how at discrete points what the impulse response is. If you want to know what it is between the 2 points, actually, because we know this from imaging, from stereo, you can just do, if you play two sound sources here, you'll hear it in the middle. So normally what we do is we literally just play it from the two sound sources at equal volume, and you'll hear it in the middle if you play it more from one. So you can basically just pan between the two, effectively, if you want to move the sound source, but it's not to do with the capturing of the HRTF. You can also interpolate HRTFs with a weighted sum, where you basically create impulse responses between the points, because you time align them and then you again weight them. So that's called barocentric interpolation. Is that kind of, I don't know if that. And then one possible solution for the limited data is maybe we can generate some synthetic data and use some transfer learning to improve our solution, as it were. So the problem with how do we fit a spherical thing to a grid? Well, there's lots of ways that we can do this. In fact, every map that you look at has done this for the globe, right? The problem with that particular projection is that you can imagine Russia is like stretched massively and way too big for it. And there's always fun when you move the countries around, you actually realize how small they are. So we want a slightly better mapping where it keeps points that are together in the sphere together in the mapping. And one good way of doing this is to use a cubed sphere and then to flatten it effectively. So you get 6 planes of the cube, but we don't really care about sounds coming beneath you. No sounds really come from beneath you. So we effectively have five planes, as it were. So you can imagine this is the particular data set that we have. So this is measurements that we would take. So each one of these points represents an impulse response. The colors are just there to show you where they get mapped to the cube sphere. And all we do is we map them to a cube. And we get something like this if we flatten it, which is basically now we have like 5 images. And then what we can do is this barocentric interpolation. So we can basically make a nice uniform grid, because this is very dense. Actually, by doing the interpolation, we're not going to add that many errors. Barocentric interpolation only starts to break down when you have very few sample points. But if you have a lot of sample points, taking a weighted sum of the impulse responses actually gives a pretty good result. So now we basically got an image that's uniformly spaced, and we can use the research from images to upsample our HRTFs. Just to mention, obviously, that there is a relation between the images because you have them wrapping around corners, right? So on the sphere, these 2 points read together. So one way to incorporate that is we just add the actual panels with its overlapping sides.
And is it the case, so you said you're not interested in the bottom, so yeah. It means that you've got a fixed orientation already, so there's where to pick the corners.
So you can see that in this setup, the lowest measure is minus 45 degrees up here, and we're going lower, and it would actually always be impossible. So effectively, you just don't have any sample points around there, which.
So in terms of how you map your sphere to your cube, it's obvious what's the top, but is it obvious where the bottom, what the right corner should be? Because obviously you can rotate it around. So
yeah, it doesn't actually, for this particular measurement, it never actually gets.
I'm just worrying about the bottom. So I'm just worrying about the mapping of the sphere to the cube. So obviously, if you rotated the cube a bit, what would be on the corners would be different. Does that make any difference?
That is true. Yeah, I don't think it does because of this. This is why we kind of do this wrapping. And then we put some constraints that say that these are actually together, so the weights are sort of fixed for this, and then we do something slightly. It's different, but it wouldn't matter, I don't think, if you changed the orientation. The thing that would matter is obviously you would want all of them to be the same. So if you had your training data and your test data where one was flipped, then it would matter because obviously if you have a sound source coming from this side, it's going to be much louder in this ear than this ear. If you start moving it, so actually the cube is shifted, then everything is shifted, right? And the neural network won't realize that the image is completely shifted unless you trained it, I guess, on all the variations of orientations of cubes, I guess. Does that kind of answer your question? Yeah. So this is our target, and to go between these two, we'll introduce some errors, but perceptually not very relevant errors. And then effectively what we did is throw away some sample points and then wanted to upsample back to the original, where we go even to sort of 5 sample points. We use 1 point per, and then can we go back? So what were some of the results that we got? And we basically compared our super resolution GAN with barocentric interpolation. And you can see the difference. HRTF selection we added because a lot of people would say, well, why don't you just use a random HRTF from the dataset? But then to make it slightly better than random, we said, why don't we find the best fitting and the worst fitting HRTF based on the metric that we were using, which is this log spectral distortion. So effectively what this metric does is it looks at the two spectrums and then says how different they are. The issue with this that we'll see is, are those differences actually perceptually relevant or not? So it might be that there's a notch in one and not in the other, but actually that notch is perceptually, no one cares. But you can see that at least at high levels, actually the barocentric seems to do better. But then when you get to very small sample points, because obviously barocentric doesn't have any information, like any history or prior knowledge, it performs much worse than the SRGAN. What's more interesting is if you look at this one, which actually people have created is auditory models that try to replicate how a listener would do a listening test. In this case, a localization test. So if you have two HRTFs and you want to compare how similar they are, what the auditory model will do will say, okay, if this is your real HRTF and you're using this other HRTF to localize sound sources, how good will you be at localizing sound sources with this new HRTF, given this is sort of your template or your own HRTF? And the different metrics are, the MSC, mean error is literally if you were to point, so you hear a sound and you point, how accurate are you? What's the errors? And you can see that there's a target, and the target is because degrees out, as it were. And you can understand that because above you, it's actually really hard to localize, and behind you. So the target is the best if you put into the model the same HRTF. So you put in the ground truth for both. You get the target, which is the same for all sample levels. And that's just used as the benchmark. The quadrant error is if you divide sphere into quadrants. If you're outside the quadrant, then you're so bad that you're not included in the mean squared error. You're just included as a quadrant error. And you can see that. And then the polar accuracy is more like a bias. So you want the bias to be 0. If the bias is not 0, then it means you're always underestimating or overestimating the localization performance. But you can see that even though there's not too much difference between these two in the log spectral distortion, which is just looking at spectral differences, when you start looking at auditory models, they actually start performing, this one has like a really bad bias. So although this is sort of a large variance, at least the mean of the bias is 0, whereas this one, the mean's way off. And then again here in the quadrant error, it goes really bad. We'll come back to this when we do the lab challenge, because we use the same metrics for the lab challenge. Anyone happy with this? Okay, so then the other thing we did was we thought, well, we need to create some more data because we don't have very much data. So we were using a data set that actually had about, I can't remember, about 200 or so participants. It will tell me at the end, so maybe it was 170 or something. But we basically created some synthetic data using meshes. So we generated some fake ears using what's called a parametric pinner model, and then we stitched them to a head, and we generated 1,000 bits of data. And what we were trying to see was, is it better to have more data, or is it better to have higher quality data? So we effectively did transfer learning with another data set and with this synthetic data to see which one performs better, to try and start to answer that question a little bit. And we played around with, so the way that it actually works is you create this mesh, and then you use something called mesh to HRTF, which is effectively ray tracing to create your HRTF. So it works out how the sound will refract all around your pinner and go into your ear canal. The more polygons you have, the more computationally intensive this task is. So if you have a very low mesh, then you end up with something that, so if you have very small polygons, it takes about 6 hours per HRTF to generate. It takes a long time, but you can get bigger ones. One thing you can be a bit clever is you can make obviously around the ear have much smaller polygons around their head, which we don't care so much about. So we did this. We also checked that if you take a scan of someone's face, which this is someone's real face, and scan, and you measure the acoustic measurement with this particular mesh, and then mesh to HRTF, how similar are they? And then you can see what's the higher frequencies, maybe they deviate slightly, but it's fairly reasonable. This is just trying to show how good actually is this sort of mesh to HRTF, which is using this boundary element method to create the HRTFs. Then there's obviously many ways you can do transfer learning. We did the most simple, which is just train the entire network on the synthetic data and then train it again on the real data and see how well it improves. There are other more sophisticated ways, and I'm sure nowadays there's even more better ways of doing it, where you just look at sort of the higher levels of the network. But So in theory, this is our setup. You train the synthetic data. So you take your meshes, you create 1,000 fake HRTFs using this approach, and then you train the GAN, and then you reinitialize the outputs, and then you train it again with the actual data that you care about, the data set that you're using, so the training set. This was the model architecture that I'm not going to go into, but it's basically the same model architecture that was used for the image super resolution image upsampling, where you just have a discriminator and a generator network. So the data used, so I said we had 1,000 synthetic HRTFs. The Sonicom data set that was also used for transfer learning had 203. And then this is the actual data set that we were using for training and testing. I should have put this earlier. This was the log spectral distortion metric, but you can see how this is actually quite a poor metric, because all you're doing is comparing differences in spectrum and then averaging it across everything, which isn't really telling you very much about perceptually whether these things matter or not. But this is the performance we got. So to start with, actually, I've shown this already. This is the performance without any transfer learning. And then if you do transfer learning, you can see that you actually get, so this is with the synthetic data set. So you trained it on 1,000 synthetic sample points first, or if you trained it on the Sonicom data set first before training it on this RE data set, which is the Acoustics Research Institute. And you can see that the red actually seems to be the best for all of them. So if you have 1,000 synthetic data sets, it's clearly learning a lot more of the structure, because the model actually doesn't have any information about the structure of the data. So by giving it a lot more data, lo and behold, hardly surprising, it can learn better the structure of the data, so that when you give it the real data, it performs better, which is kind of the aim of transfer learning in any case. So even at sort of high sample points, it's getting closer at least to the barocentric interpolation. Any questions after this? And then the model, again, you can see how barocentric interpolation one really starts to break when you have very low sample points. And this was the bias, basically. This is the localization accuracy in terms of mean squared error. What's interesting is when you compare the differences between these metrics and the LSC, sometimes you see big differences and sometimes you see no differences, which is actually just highlighting the discrepancy between the two. So if you see here, actually, when you look at the lower sample points, the two methods actually don't seem that different. So the baseline is not performing that much better. But if we go back to here, it does seem that the baseline is actually pointing to spectral distortion. So this is kind of what the listener acoustics personalization challenge told us as well, which we kind of expected. And then this was this is the quadrant error. Again, the baseline's not really doing any better in the auditory model, which is what's interesting. Okay, so then we did this and we thought there's quite a lot of people working on HRTF upsampling, but no one's really come up with a good framework for evaluating it. So why don't we do an IEEE signal processing challenge and get people to submit their solutions? Because a lot of people had already written papers, so they didn't have to start from scratch. They could just submit their solutions and we could do a benchmark. And then at least we have a data set that we can give to people and they can use to benchmark their methods going forward. So the task was basically the task that I just described, where you had to upsample from very high spatial resolution, like very low spatial resolution to very high spatial resolution. So we gave them very challenging tasks, effectively. So we had 12 subjects that we measured at Imperial as part of the Sonicom data set that weren't publicly available. And the sparsity level was much lower. So 3, 5, but the 5 were located in the same direction. So you can imagine 5 sort of just in one direction rather than distributed evenly. This one was forward, up top and to the left, and then 19 evenly distributed and 100 evenly distributed. And we had 3 different subjects per sparsity level. So this was the task. You were given these 12 subjects and you had to upsample them, even though you didn't know what the ground truth was. There was 2 stages that we did for the validation. So the first thing we wanted to check is the solution reasonable? And effectively, you had to get 10 out of your 12 meeting certain thresholds on these 3 metrics. Time delay between your 2 ears. The ILD is the level difference, so the loudness between your 2 ears, and the log spectral distortion, so the differences in the spectrum. And as you can see, everyone's passed except these guys. They the two baselines that we use, that failed completely on the lower sort of sampling levels. SH means spherical harmonics. So spherical harmonics are often used in spatial audio. They're sometimes called ambisonics, and they're effectively basis functions for a sphere. So you're effectively trying to work out the weighting of spherical basis functions for using the sample points that you have, which is quite nice actually as an interpolation method, because the basis functions are obviously continuous. So you use your discrete points, and there's obviously a sampling theorem that says how many points you need to get a certain resolution. But effectively, that's what spherical harmonics do. You take your points, but again, it has no prior information. All you're doing is you're mapping your sample points to the basis functions and saying this is the weighting you should use, and then you've got a continuous thing, and you can just take the points that you want for the upsampled version. Okay, this is how we weighted them, and I'll come back to this. We effectively just weighted the three metrics here evenly, so we said we're just going to weight these the same and add them up using z-scores, where we normalized based on the baselines. There is an argument that I'll come to where this one is much higher than the others, but then it feels quite arbitrary that we've just decided that the LSD should be weighted much higher. So it seems fair to weight them all evenly, but is that actually the most reasonable thing to do? These were the different descriptions of the models. So some of them were published, some of them weren't. What's interesting is most of them are just machine learning. A lot of the teams didn't really work on audio at all. They just sort of thought, let's just apply our machine learning algorithm to this particular use case. And you can imagine that there's autoencoders. The interesting one, so this one here is actually just a version of spherical harmonic interpolation. And obviously the GAN is the one I just presented, which kind of does a bit of both, because it does barocentric interpolation at the beginning to map everything to a uniform grid, and then it does machine learning, whereas all the other ones map directly to the correct sample points. And Merle, which is Mitsubishi, submitted two versions, and they actually performed very similar. So I don't think there was that much difference between the two. So what you find is there's these two kind of approaches that we wanted to compare, which is machine learning based or algorithmic upsampling, which would be the spherical harmonic or the barocentric interpolation. So you can imagine that algorithmic, you just don't have any information in between the points, whereas in the sort of machine learning base, in theory, you have some knowledge because you know something about, or you have some prior information that you've trained the network on for history of what this sort of structure of this data looks like. And it was interesting to see how well these two performances compete against. So this was the performance that they got on the log spectral distortion. And what's interesting is when you have a very high points in space, you obviously achieve quite good performance. And what we did for this very dotted line for the evaluation paper is we just took the average HRTF of all of the HRTFs in the data set. So we were saying, let's just create the most generic HRTF, where we just take literally we just average all the HRTFs, because if you can't do better than that, or if you're performing the same as that, you're basically getting a generic HRTF. So you're not actually personalizing, you're just finding a good generic HRTF for the data set itself. So what's interesting is as you start to go down to lower sampling rates, effectively what you're doing is not personalizing, even though it looks like you're still getting some good personalization. You're not doing that much better than just a generic HRTF. So effectively at high sample rates, you are personalizing, and then as time goes on, you just become more and more generic, where you're just giving a nice generic HRTF. This was for the time delay between the two ears, so the time difference, and again, you see the same kind of pattern. And for the level difference, so the loudness between the two ears. So you can see that the baseline methods do extremely badly. Luckily, we didn't actually do that well either. I think otherwise people would have thought we cheated on the challenge. So, and then these are the particular summary scores and Merle won. But I think what was quite interesting is we did try to do a bit of exploratory work on the evaluation that we used. And one thing we realized is, as I said, we weighted the three metrics that we were using for the challenge itself equally. Now with the winners, luckily, it kind of didn't matter what the weighting was. But what they showed, depending on the weighting, you can actually change the rank. So if you look at this particular submission, which was an autoencoder, you can see that if you just looked and you weighted the ILD to 100%, then they're coming seventh, so really bad. But if you just look at the LSD, which is the most important metric, they're coming first. And then if you're just looking at the ITD, they come fourth. So really, depending on the weighting, it massively affects their ranking of the solutions, which kind of means since the weighting was chosen a bit arbitrarily and people would disagree with what weighting actually was good, especially because ITD, you could argue that you could just use a sphere. If you know the distance between someone's ears, you can just use a simple ITD model. So you just have a sphere and you just work out the distance between the two ears and you can work out the delay. So most people would say this metric's kind of redundant. So although this solution, which the only one's winning on this, actually, it's not a very useful metric because it's really easy to get almost perfectly. This one is capturing all the spectral differences, so it's much harder to accurately mimic. So it's interesting to see that as soon as you start weighting the metrics differently, you get a much different ranking. But I guess this is always the case. This was just to show that it's actually quite hard to compare, or how do you even visualize the data so that you can compare the performance. So this was, you can visualize it obviously as spectrograms. Tells you a little bit of information, but it's quite hard to see. Again, this is more showing that there are differences in the spectrum, but whether these differences matter is really hard to know. If it's a really bad approach, then obviously, so when you've got three positions, you can see this doesn't match really at all, whereas this one and this one look quite similar. But it's hard to know, okay, well, it doesn't look very similar, but how bad is it unless you listen to it effectively. You can also visualize it where you look at the errors distributed base. And one thing that's nice about this is when you have a method that's algorithmic, which is the top one. So this top one was the improved spherical harmonic interpolation. You can see that these little circles, probably quite hard to see here, are the points that you were given. So 3 points here, so 1, 2, 3. You can see that around those points, the algorithmic one performs better. So it's got a less dark area around the points, because obviously around those points, it can do a better estimation. But the sort of machine learning approaches don't necessarily perform better near those points. So you'll get some where, if, for example, our GAN method, you get a really bad error here, even though it's right next to a sample point. So it kind of doesn't make sense. It also highlighted issues with how you actually average these, right? So it makes sense that unlike images, the pixels that you have that you upsample to get high resolution, the original pixels aren't actually correct, right? They're sort of an average of the pixels in the high resolution image. In this case, these particular points are perfect, right? So it makes sense that after you've finished upsampling, you should just take your input sample points and make them part of your output. But then the issue is then you get continuity differences. So that will decrease your log spectral distortion error because you're now getting 100% accuracy for the points that you were given, especially if you're given 100 points, you actually get 100 points, and then you replace those 100 points with the exact correct solution, you're going to get a better LSD. But it's probably actually going to sound worse because you'll get a discontinuity where you've changed those points, which again shows you this problem with sort of just trying to optimize a particular metric that might not be good. And actually, maybe you need a way of looking at sort of the smoothness as you go around the sphere, not just the actual absolute errors, as it were, which is another thing highlighted by this challenge. I thought this was quite a nice plot. So we tried to look at sort of this idea of, is it just creating a generic HRTF? And what's quite interesting is if you have difficulty level 100, so the reference is sort of right here. It's following the green line almost completely right here, red line. And the generic HRTF, the average, is the bottom line, which doesn't really follow. But then we get the exact opposite thing when you have 3 sampling points, which makes you think that it's just learning the average. So here, if you look at the dotted line, the red line actually follows almost the average HRTF and doesn't personalize at all, so it doesn't follow the green line. Which kind of leads us to the conclusion that actually at low sampling, well, when you've got a low resolution that you're upsampling from, although it might sound okay, effectively what it's doing is just creating a good average of your data set. It's not actually personalizing at all, which is the aim of the task. So it was quite a nice thing to highlight, I think, in the spectrum at least. Obviously, this is just one particular location. And then what we also saw is if you start running auditory models, so this is the auditory models that support with the quadrant error, mean squared error, and the bias, you can see that actually the methods that do really well in the log spectral distortion don't necessarily do as well when you start looking at the auditory models. So you can see that Mel came first and second by quite a long way. If you go back to here, you can see that they're quite a long way. And R1, our method, came last by quite a long way, which is fun. But if you actually look at the auditory metrics, so ours is here, the blue one, it actually performs every single time the winners for the auditory metric, which is probably because we use this barocentric interpolation and we're not just optimizing in the same way for the log spectral distortion. So as soon as you start looking at perceptual, or more perceptual, because really we'd have to do subjective listening tests, which would be very time intensive. But at least with these auditory models, you start to see that just because you do well in the log spectral distortion, unless you're getting 100% perfect accuracy, then you don't know if the errors you're getting are perceptually relevant or not. And it's just a really big headache in spatial audio of then how do we create a loss function then that captures perceptual elements. And that's very hard because this particular model, you have to run like 100 trials and it takes sort of like 10 minutes to run, I guess, for each particular point, depending on how many trials you run, and it takes an average, which you can't use in a machine learning algorithm that needs to almost run the loss function instantaneously. Also, it can't be differentiated. I know there's ways now of getting around that, but differentiable loss functions are obviously much nicer for gradient descent and things like this. So it was just interesting to highlight that actually, and the dotted line is the target, that once you start looking at auditory models, the whole picture changes completely. This wasn't actually part of the challenge. We just thought that when we wrote the review paper to include it, to just show that actually the whole challenge is kind of flawed, because what would you care about? You care about this performance, not the performance that we actually evaluated. But then the challenge, you could have your loss function as the LSD, so it was trained for the wrong loss function and evaluated on the wrong loss function, and it doesn't actually equate that well. And what's interesting is the spherical harmonic one, which is the algorithmic, again, performs fairly good as well. So I thought this was quite an interesting result. These are the people who helped run the challenge, so these are the chairs, and then we had these guys, and this was in 2024. So a little while ago now. But we have a lot of open questions then in immersive audio of how do we do it, because people are still using LSD mainly, and you rarely see papers looking at sort of perceptual characteristics. But this is all about personalization, and actually there's a good argument to say, which I was saying earlier, that a system can adapt to the user anyway. So how much do we really need to personalize at all? Can't we just use a generic HRTF if it seems to work well, and then the human just adapts to it? And there's lots of apps and things where people have actually done training to prove that over time you can just learn to use someone else's ears effectively. If you imagine if you're a child, you have a very small head, very tiny ears, and as you grow, your HRTF is constantly changing. If you wear a hat, you change your HRTF. So we're very good at adapting to using new HRTFs over time. So that raised the question of should we personalize or not, and how important is personalization, especially because it's quite hard to achieve and it's time consuming and expensive. I think the jury was out, but I think places like Meta and Sony are starting to realize that maybe personalization isn't the way, and actually it should be contextual. So maybe it's task-specific HRTFs that matter. And then if personalization is needed, how do we do it? So the lab challenge just focused on taking acoustic measurements and then using maybe machine learning to upsample them. But maybe you could do it in a different way. So you could use morphological features. So maybe people take pictures of ears and you try and work out the shape of the ears, or you try and create a 3D mesh from an image and then use the 3D mesh to generate the HRTF. But then if it's task specific, maybe actually we should do a localization test or a speech intelligibility test. So you get someone to use a different HRTF, create a scene where there's some noise and there's some speech, and they're trying to listen to the speech. And depending on how well they perform at that task, we can find the HRTF that's best for them to do that particular task, rather than a HRTF that completely mimics that actual HRTF in practice. And yeah, Imperial, they did a little bit of EGG as well to see if you can use that to try and create HRTF's selection. And then also we have loads of issues when we do training, because there's a lot of stuff to do with perceptual training rather than personalization. So when you run listening tests or localization tests, eventually what happens is you get a massive improvement in performance at the beginning because it's just procedural. So people just get better at doing the test. And the actual personalization aspect is quite hard to see in a lot of tests. So how useful is it? It's very useful for tasks like localization, but how often in real life are you localizing sounds? Not very often. If you need to localize a sound, you turn and look at the sound, right? So you're using your eyes, and also you're only localizing within sort of in front of you, sort of plus or minus 30 degrees. Whereas these localization challenges, tasks, you're sitting there facing forward, you hear a sound, you have to point to the sound without moving your head, which is just not realistic at all of any real life situation. And then probably the thing we do most is actually the speech intelligibility task, maybe. So we try and use spatial release from masking. So if you're in a noisy environment, you kind of beamform to just hear the sound from one given direction and mask out interferers that way. So maybe that's actually a better way. There's this big debate on HRTFs or DTFs, which is direct transfer functions, where we just remove the average of all of the impulse responses around the head. Because actually, surely we just care about the differences. We don't care about the average for each point, because the HRTF is meant to capture at least the differences as you move around. The headphone transfer functions, how much different headphone that you use matter. Again, that's not really clear. Some people think that it massively matters. Other people think it's a waste of time looking into it. And then also none of this work actually looks at reverb. And actually reverb is probably way more important than the HRTF anyway. So actually, if you have some good perceptual reverb in a room when you're trying to create an immersive environment, it's probably actually way more useful than a personalized HRTF. And then, yeah, how do we compute it efficiently? Because you can imagine, so we did some work at Imperial. If you take a room, what actual things in the room matter to create realistic reverb? And then one thing I'm interested in is if we're going to move away from personalization, maybe at least for assistive hearing technologies, we should look at using machine learning to try and understand how we can improve people at particular tasks. So rather than looking at recreating someone's actual HRTF, maybe we can look at enhancing their spatial cues, so giving them sort of a superhuman HRTF that basically is designed in such a way where you're not limited by the sort of constraints of sort of evolution that we have, smaller ears, because, you know, we don't just use them for hearing, but they need to be small, as you can imagine if we were hunter-gatherers and things. But there's no reason why, if you're creating a virtual one, why you can't give someone massive ears or increase their head size by double. So it means that the time delay is sort of easier to distinguish. The motivation for this is obviously hearing impaired users really struggle to localize sounds, and many hearing aids actually hinder spatial cues rather than improve them. So you can imagine they're mainly built for speech intelligibility, so they destroy all spatial cues effectively. And if studies have shown that humans can adapt to someone else's HRTF, maybe we can take advantage of that. And maybe we can augment the spatial cues based on the person's hearing and based on the task that they're trying to do. And then the questions that then you need to actually ask is, can a human adapt to these cues? What are the limitations? So if we increase someone's head size, maybe if you increase it by half, it's still fine. If you double it, maybe you start to get into a point where people can't adapt because you sort of reach the limits of human adaptation. And then do these augmented cues actually improve the person's listening abilities? And what's the differences between individuals with normal hearing, hard of hearing? So you can imagine if you're hard of hearing, you lose the higher frequencies and the lower frequencies. The lower frequencies help with time delay of arrival, and the higher frequencies are all the shape of the pinna, where all the refractions and reflections around the pinna that you lose. So maybe there's a way, if we make the ear bigger, you're effectively shifting down the notches in the HRTF impulse responses into a range that the listener can hear. So this is basically an NIA that I recently submitted on this idea. So this is, and I've just had a PhD student start working on it, but basically rather than personalizing, maybe the main idea that we're actually looking at is, can we create lots of HRTFs using the synthetic approach that we used before? So we use this sort of meshes, we use the parametric pinna model, and then can we learn sort of a mapping between those parameters in the HRTF that we're generating synthetically, and maybe an auditory metric like spatial release from masking. So what sort of improvement you get in a noisy environment for hearing a listener. I think it's quite an interesting idea because it changes the paradigm where in the past, so I had a friend who was really hard of hearing and he got some new hearing aids and he hated the fact that he couldn't hear his footsteps when he walked down the street. So the whole idea of this is we're trying to give back people or users the autonomy to select what they hear using their own cognitive processes, rather than an algorithm doing acoustic scene classification, deciding where you are, deciding what you want to listen to, and then enhancing that particular signal. We're trying to help people actually have spatial cues so they can use those spatial cues to do that task themselves, if that makes sense. Anyway, I think I'll stop there. Thank you for listening. Hopefully it was somewhat interesting. If you have any questions, do come. Sorry, it's not so AI orientated, but at least maybe somewhat interesting to see what people are working on in audio, at least using AI.
So, say, is the kind of state-of-the-art network that is being used now? Is it still GANs or is the solution?
I don't know what the state of the art would be. I would say that the one that would be most interesting would be graphs, because it makes sense to me that if you're doing this projection to a surface that doesn't really make sense, you should be able to put in the coordinates of the points and use graphs. I don't think I've ever seen someone use graphs to solve the upsampling problem, at least. But I think that would be a very interesting way to approach it. The problem with the lab challenge is people didn't actually have to submit. So Merle didn't actually give away too much how their solution worked because they're a company, right? So they don't want to. But most people seem to be doing some sort of autoencoder with some latent space that you're trying to learn. So there's a big push at the moment is, can you create a latent space that captures HRTFs? It's very easy to create one where you can represent HRTFs in a lower dimension. The problem is you can't interpolate between the points in the latent space and get realistic HRTFs. There seems to be different sides of the same coin of trying to create a latent space, and then effectively the upsampling is using those points to find out where in the latent space you are to generate the HRTF, I guess. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. You definitely could. I don't think any of the methods that were presented use diffusion models, but this is a bit like large language models. Everyone just tries to, because I do a lot of work in music as well, everyone just tries to change music into text and then use large language models. So you can convert it to MIDI, and then you can convert the MIDI into some symbolic representation of text, and then you just use a foundational model or a transformer.
People that people think about using, so we talk about people will have reading text, obviously only maybe a part of the center or benefit more for certain. Have you looked at also other type of networks that are impacted by other kind, whether neurodiversity, and how the different ways of sampling can change the number of samples and change their reception?
I personally haven't. I know that Kings, I think, do a lot of work on this. Yeah, so I've mainly worked on hearing aids and sort of trying to optimize a hearing aid for someone who can't hear certain frequencies. So maybe they've lost the ability to hear certain frequencies. So maybe we can move the notches of the HRTF away from those frequencies. Neurodiverse, yeah, it's a whole other. But I'm pretty sure Kings look at things like autism. They also look at sort of other diseases like Parkinson's and things. That is true, yeah. I think it's really hard because, especially if you're working with hard of hearing listeners, sometimes you can work with the NIHR, the National Institute of Health Research, and then you can get into a hospital, but that takes ages. Trying to get hard of hearing listeners is really difficult. So you basically have to beg people, and you normally get really small sample sizes that probably aren't very good in terms of diversity, but it's just really difficult to find people who are willing to. Yeah, it's much easier if it's someone who's not hard of hearing. Yeah, and everyone's hearing is very different. So another thing you could talk about is the fact that audiograms don't really capture at all how someone hears sound. So they look at, basically they'll play you, if you do a listening test, they'll play you sort of sine sweeps, but they'll play a sine tone at different frequencies, and you press a clicker when you hear it. So you can see the hearing loss at certain frequencies, but it tells you nothing about the spectral smearing. Some people with hard of hearing also have sort of memory problems as well. So sometimes it's actually sort of a cognitive problem rather than a hearing problem, which is very hard as well.
It's very difficult.
Yeah. So almost the audiology departments are sort of from like the 1960s, the methods they're using. We've actually got the head of audiology at the Imperial College NHS Trust going to give a talk in a few weeks. So I'm really curious to talk to her about how they do it in a clinical way, because yeah, it's just really hard to isolate and to find participants as well.
Questions online? If no further questions, let's thank the speaker again.